Well, hello again, dear ones. I have a story I'd like to share with you today. It's what the lightning shows. It all started on a Sunday, somewhere on the Kansas plains, and it started with an engine light. I pulled off the highway, found a strange bed to spend the night in, and the next morning found a shop that would look at the car. Most of the day spent in the waiting room, but by about 2 o'clock I was back on the road, granted a little bit lighter in the wallet. And what the ego did in that moment is what it always does. It filed the whole thing off as a minor inconvenience, and I told myself the worst was over. Well, 30 miles later, that light came back on, and then it started blinking. I made it to a Ford dealership in Salina, Kansas. The staff there were kind and patient and genuinely helpful, and I want to be clear about that. What followed wasn't their fault. It was simply the nature of the season I was in. I needed to leave the car overnight, so I found another hotel room. I hadn't planned for any of this. Tuesday morning, I get the phone call that things look good. I should be back on the road in a couple hours. But that's not what really happened. By the time I made it over to the dealership, the verdict had changed. The car wasn't going back to Colorado, not anytime soon. And what makes all of this strange was, as many of you know, I was in the middle of a housing transition. My wife and I are searching for a new home in Colorado and holding the vision of what that home might look like or where it might be. I was doing a lot of prayer work and trusting the outcome. But here I am, stranded in the middle of Kansas. There's not a rental car to be found. A hailstorm had moved through the area in late April, and all the rental cars were being used by the insurance companies. Now, I will say the ego had a field day with all this. It assembled every piece of evidence the situation offered and delivered a conclusion with great authority. The ego was saying, this is what falling apart looks like. But that's not what it was. It's just what it looked like. I want you to remember there's a difference between what something looks like and what something actually is. Learning to live in that difference, that is the whole of this spiritual life we live. So here it is, June in Colorado, which also means storm season. Now, for anyone that spent time along the Front Range, we know the ritual. The radar lights up on the forecast. The meteorologists call for golf ball size hail and 70-mile-an-hour winds. And the news speaks with the full authority of someone who has been wrong before and will be wrong again. So we cancel our plans, we pull the car into the garage or cover it with blankets and wait. And then more often than not, the storm misses us entirely. It dissolves over the divide or tracks south and spends itself out over empty rangeland where there's nothing to damage. A few hours later, walk outside. The air's been washed clean and cool, and the late afternoon sun is turning everything gold. There's a certain feeling of relief, but also something kind of absurd about all that fear, all that preparation. Those blankets covering my car in the driveway. What I want us to know is the ego is the worst meteorologist we will ever employ. The ego runs forecast models constantly. It watches every variable. The conversation that went quiet, the bill that came in higher than expected, the silence where a response could have been. And it assembles all of that into a probability of catastrophe. The ego speaks with authority. It uses technical language. It shows you the radar models, and most of what it predicts never arrives. As I reflect upon that, I'm reminded that Ernest Holmes understood this with great precision. Ernest taught us that the law of mind does not punish, it reflects. What we broadcast inwardly, we receive outwardly, which means a life organized around the anticipation of disaster is not a life of caution. It is a life of creation. The ego, endlessly forecasting catastrophe, becomes its own self-fulfilling weather system, and it manufactures the very conditions it claims to be warning us about. See, we don't need a hailstorm to damage our lives. When we've done that through fear and dread, it kept us from planting anything worth protecting. Living in the shelter of a storm that never comes is its own destruction. And yet, the work of a spiritual life is not to deny that storms exist. Some storms are very, very real. Some of them arrive exactly when the forecast said they would, and they are every bit as difficult as the ego perhaps promised. The question is not whether the storm will arrive. The question is what you will do when the storm does. Now, my situation in Kansas was very real. Our housing search was very uncertain. The uncertainty was not manufactured by anxiety, it was actual. We had 3 weeks left to find a home, pack a home, and get ready to move. With no sense of where that was really going to be, other than we wanted to stay in Colorado. And as many of you know, we were looking at places from Loveland to Castle Rock. The new thought, it doesn't ask us to pretend that everything is just a-okay. It does not ask us to perform cheerfully in the middle of a genuine storm or to deny that our eyes see what's going on around us. New thought asks us something far more demanding. To understand what the storm is actually doing in our lives, as our lives. Because when the real storm comes, it's not random. It's not punishment. It is not evidence that the universe has turned indifferent or hostile. When the storm arrives, it's doing something. And what I have come to understand is that what it's doing at least, 3 things all at the same time. The first thing the storm does is it strips away what has been clinging to the vine, but has already reached its end. I like to say it is the things that no longer serve. Think about the hailstorms, what it actually does to a tree, or a heavy winter snow. It takes the branches that were weakened at the joints, the growth that was diseased, the fruit that wasn't going to make it to harvest anyway, and strips all that away. The storm cannot take what is truly rooted. It only reveals what has been hanging on. So what looks like destruction, when you're standing inside of it, is often the removal of what no longer serves. What no longer serves your life or my life. The storm is not tearing away what belongs to you. It is clearing what is already finished. The second thing the storm does is illuminate. Lightning flashes. It does not create what it shows you. It reveals what was already present but in the dark. That's exactly what this whole thing in Kansas did. Not in one dramatic flash, but in the slow and relentless pressure of wave after wave of inconvenience. And each step stripped away another layer of my comfortable assumptions. It stripped away the backup plans the ego had constructed until what remained was the one thing that had been true the entire time. The home, our new home, was waiting for us. The path was clear. The storm didn't create that truth, but it showed it to me in a way that I wasn't looking for. See, there are things we cannot see when circumstances are comfortable and the road is smooth. The knowing that is available to us in the midst of a storm is the knowing that comfort cannot produce. Now, the third thing the storm does, and this one takes a little bit of trust, is it causes completion. Thomas Troward understood something essential about the nature of what looks like disorder. Apparent disorder, according to Troward, is higher order, arriving faster than the rational mind can track. The chaos is not the conclusion. It is the compression that precedes the fullness. Think about what pressure does to fruit still on a vine. The bruising is not the end of the fruit. The storm is not destroying what is there, it is pressing the sweetness forward. What the storm is pressing in you is not being destroyed, it is being completed. So let's go back to that Ford dealership. It's Tuesday morning in Kansas, and now I'm being told that the car that was supposed to carry me home wasn't going anywhere soon. What I found in that moment was not despair. What I found was grounding. See, there's something that does not move when everything else is moving. The knowingness, settled, inner, independent of circumstances. That's what remains intact when the outer world is full of reorganization. When the forecast is wrong, when the wave comes back for a second pass, when the thing you thought was resolved turns out to require one more round. Neville Goddard called it the feeling of the wish fulfilled. So what did he mean by that? Because that's not a technique. It's not a visualization exercise you do in the morning and set aside by noon. It is a settled interior state that exists independent of present conditions. It is the conviction, unguarded. It is a conviction that the desired reality is already real, already accomplished in the one place that matters the most, and that the outer world is simply in the process of catching up. The home I sit in right now, already existed. We just hadn't found it yet. I knew we weren't living in hope. I knew we were living in trust. Because something was already accomplished at the level of knowing. And I was just waiting for the physical world to finish expressing it, to catch up. The broken down car was not evidence against the truth. It was an event in the physical world rearranging itself around the interior truth that I hadn't yet fully expressed. Remember, motion is not the same thing as collapse. And the outer world catching up is not always a smooth and comfortable process. Our spiritual life is not about preventing storms. It's about building it within us a quality of knowing so deep and so rooted that when the hail does come, we don't lose ourselves in it all. We stand in the truth that we know. We watch with genuine curiosity sometimes, rather than terror. We watch for what the lightning is about to show us. So this time last week, the car was still in Kansas. And all of this has one more piece of the story. Laura and I decided I would rent a car and drive back to Kansas to trade the car for a check. I had found an internet company that would pay me for the car, but I had to take the title and the key, and rather than try to mail that back and forth through a dealership where, although very nice people, I had no real knowledge of who they were. So we decided to rent a car and drive. Now it's June, so the rental car company was very, very expressive about their concerns around hail damage, and that it would be my responsibility financially if any hail did happen. So I packed some extra blankets in the back of the car just in case I hit a storm out on the highway. And yes, just this past Thursday morning, I got up real early and drove 6 hours back to Salina, Kansas. And wouldn't you know, it was a glorious day, not a storm in sight. I arrived at the dealership before noon with a 5-hour window for which the truck driver would come and pick up the car. Now, the people in Kansas were wonderful. Everyone at the dealership was kind and caring and kind of would keep an eye out for me. All I needed was a truck driver so I could sign over the title and give him the key and grab the check. And then this chapter would be closed. Well, wouldn't you know it, some mistakes were made. And the check wasn't in Salina with the driver, it was in Wichita, 90 miles away. So what started with a 2:00 phone call saying, I'm on my way. And I'm thinking, yay, I'll be on the road by 3. Well, that stretched on a bit. The dealership was closing at 5:30 and still no truck driver. He called and said he'd be there by 6 with check in hand. And as I waited that last extra hour, wouldn't you know it, a storm pushed through. A pretty heavy rain. A squall passed over. And it was loud enough to hear the rain on the roof of the dealership. So here I am, sitting in a dealership surrounded by hundreds of hail-damaged cars from the storm back in April. Thinking, oh my gosh, I don't want to pay for the rental if there's damage. So there I am out in the storm, covering the car with blankets, trusting that we wouldn't get any hail. Well, the squall moved through. The sun came back out. Not a drop of hail in sight. And just as I was pulling the wet blankets off the car and hoping they might dry a little, up pulls the tow truck driver. Mr. Brzezinski, where's your car? I have a check for you. It was in that moment, in that clearing, as the sun began to warm the ground again, I understood something. The delay that I was not happy about had kept me off the highway. I wasn't up on the highway doing 75 miles an hour when the squall hit. See, the divine wasn't a delay. The divine was being precise. It kept me protected. It kept the car protected. It kept everything in order so that I'd make it home safe. The delay kept me safe from what I couldn't see was coming. It's how the divine works when we work with it rather than against it. It doesn't always work in the way we choose, but always on a timeline that is perfect. So 5 minutes later, the truck driver had the keys, the car, and the title. I had a check in my hand. Thanks to the technology, the advances in technology, the check was deposited into my bank account, and I was back on the road. Yep, a little bit later than I had planned, but I was heading home. Heading to our new home. Heading to a home that's still stacked full of boxes, waiting to be unpacked. But this morning, I'm sitting here with all of it. An engine light that came on 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. Extra nights in strange motel rooms. A false belief that I was bringing that car home. A housing search that resolved itself in a few days of heavy lifting, getting everything moved. 6 hours in the car, 6 hours at the dealership, and 6 more on the way back. And through it all, the storms, well, they happened. But they didn't change my life. I believe the chapter is now complete. And that's how I can sit here today and tell you exactly how the divine works in our lives when we work with it rather than relying on our ego. See, at every single turn in this story, the ego had a forecast. I could awfulize what was about to happen, or I could trust in the divine. The ego assembled the evidence, cited the conditions, and delivered a verdict with confidence that this was not the right thing. And at every turn, the divine was orchestrating something the ego could not see. It was stripping what had reached its end, what was no longer necessary. It illuminated what had always been true and I just wasn't seeing, and it completed what was being pressed towards fullness. And sometimes protecting us from a highway I didn't need to be on in the middle of a storm that I didn't need to experience. So if you're in a storm season right now, or you're in between storms, catching your breath, or maybe you can see something building on the horizon and the ego is already running its models, already assembling its forecasts, already preparing to deliver a verdict. Well, let it. Let the ego run its models. Let it deliver its forecasts. But do not organize your life around those forecasts. Because the ego has never once been able to see what the divine is actually doing through you. It's not what the ego is built for. The ego is built for survival. The divine is built for completion. You do not have to believe the forecast. You're allowed to stand in what you know. Stand in what you know. The interior, unargued knowing that what is already true for you is not subject to the atmospheric conditions. The truth you know does not dissolve in the rain. It does not bend in the wind. It does not require the sun to be shining for it to be real. The truth, well, it sits in the waiting room. It holds off from going out into the hail. It holds on the long drive through clear skies, check in hand, and heading home. It holds in the dark before the lightning shows you what was there the whole time. The invitation is to stand in what you know and work with the divine. The storm will do its work. And when the storm passes, you will still be standing inside the life you already knew was coming. So I invite you to enjoy that. And I invite you to join me as prayer. If you're in a comfortable place to close your eyes, I invite you to please do so and join in a deep, deep knowing that there is truly only one power, one presence, one infinite intelligence that moves and breathes and has its being as all of life. One self-existent cause that is right now taking on form and experience as your life, knowing that it'll abandon that form, abandon that experience, complete that form, complete that experience, and then take on new form and new experience. The oneness that is your life is not the ego, it is the divine. It is the wholeness, it is the fullness, it is the completion. It is the lightning flashes that illuminate the truth, and it is the truth itself. So I invite each one that may hear these words to embrace that truth, to live from that truth, and to know that the divine's got your back in all of this. Even if the ego says there's something wrong, something broken, something missing, that is not the truth. The truth is the wholeness. The truth is that everything in your life is absolutely perfect. Whole, complete, nothing missing, and nothing absent. The unfolding. Trust in the unfolding of the divine expressing itself as you. So yes, I am in a state of gratitude for this reminder, for this voyage, for this adventure, for this chapter in living a spiritual life. Knowing all is well and all is complete, I release this word into the creative law of life, knowing it is already operating to bring everything necessary and everything into fulfillment to make it so. And I let it be. And I affirm this truth by simply saying, and so it is. And so it is. Thank you, dear ones. Until next time, I wish you peace and richest blessings. Bye now.